Hello and welcome to this conversation regarding Il Mio Posto a Tavola, My Place at the Table, our documentary film, which chronicles my journey to belonging. I'm really happy to have a very special guest with me today to talk about an organization that she founded and leads, um, InterCountry Adoptee Voices, ICAV. And I want you to please welcome Lynelle uh, Young. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me here, Santo. It's lovely
Uh,
to be here.
it is such a pleasure. Um, each of us has our story and kind of our reason for why we're connected to this story. And I'd love for you to share a little bit about that with our viewers and listeners about how adoption played a role in your life and also in this work that's so important to you, but also to so many people.
Yeah, sure. So, for those who don't know me, I'm Lynelle Long. I'm actually born in Vietnam in the Vietnam War in the 70s. And I was adopted privately, or it was intended for me to be adopted privately by my Australian white parents. And they facilitated my adoption through what is known back then as a private proxy adoption, hiring a lawyer in Vietnam, my birth country, sourcing me as a child. It appears they probably got me from a hospital as a 3-day-old infant, so I was very healthy. I was in good condition. To this day, I'm 52 now. I have no idea of the circumstances of how they obtained me or the conditions of my mother or her family. So that has always been a massive question. But I arrived in Australia as a 5-month-old, and then in those days, Australia hadn't developed any intercountry adoption processes. So it was a bit of a cowboys and Indians show in the sense of people doing whatever they wanted. And so I then proceeded to stay with that family for 16 and a half years until I got to the age where I was wanting to drive a car, and you've got to have a license. Lo and behold, it kind of came to my attention really quickly that I didn't have an identity. I'm not anybody on paper, because, in fact, my paperwork from Vietnam never arrived and never was there and never existed. So I'm essentially a stateless person. And my parents then, at that stage, decided to proceed with trying to get me formally adopted through this state of Victoria, which they did. So then I grew up a bit more, got to my mid-20s, was really struggling. My adoption in that family was very difficult. It wasn't a lovely story. I was the only adopted child with four of their biological children, two on each side. So I was in the middle. And I was always treated very differently in that family. Back then, there was no education for prospective parents. Back then, the social workers just told my parents, love her like your own and everything will be okay. Now, I guess they assumed they were loving me like their own, but from my perspective, I was always treated very differently. I was made to work, kind of like the family slave, and that was normal for me. So I got to my mid-20s. I'd had a fairly challenging adoption. My parents had not at all taught me anything about my culture or origins or even had discussions about it. It was the era where you just don't talk about it, pretend it doesn't exist and it's not there, and everything will be fine. Well, I grew up experiencing racism, a lot of challenges in my life. I was always picked out, singled, never dated. So, of course, as a child, you internalize a lot of that stuff and you just think there's something fundamentally wrong with me. And you internalize that, and that becomes bad self esteem, shame about who you are. I didn't want to racially identify at all with my Asianness. I just wanted to be white and wanted to fit in and blend in and be one of them. So that's my childhood in a nutshell, which was challenging.
Yeah.
So when I got to my mid-20s, I was struggling with mental health and I was looking for support. I didn't find any really. I found domestic adoption support, but when I turned up to those, it was all people who were white who looked like their families and hadn't been born in another country at all, and certainly didn't identify with any of the racial issues.
Mhm.
So I put out a message then that, hey, I worked for IBM at that stage. I had an IT career. I created a website and I thought, if it doesn't exist, I'll have to create it. So that's actually how my network first started way back in the mid 1990s. I was a person, I didn't even know the lingo and the language. I didn't know intercountry
Right.
adoption. I just said I was born in another country. I'm an adoptee. And I basically created a hub for people like me where you're born in one country, adopted to another. And almost immediately, I had people joining from all over the world, America, Germany, UK, Netherlands, Belgium, everywhere, Canada. And so my network remains today probably the oldest, one of the oldest, it definitely is the oldest and the longest standing group or hub that allows a space for intercountry adoptees born in any birth country, adopted to any adoptive country. And, we're fairly big and substantial now, thousands. And yeah, and I went from creating a support space and connecting and learning off each other and just finding our voices to eventually, after 15 years, I became more involved in advocacy, speaking up, standing
Mm.
up at government levels and wanting to really change the system because I was hearing my journey repeated en masse.
Right.
And that's what inspired me to create my network, InterCountry Adoptee Voices, or ICAV.
So, first of all, I have to note, I just realized I misspoke your name. I am
That's
so
all right.
I
That's
am
all
so
right.
sorry. Lynelle Long.
Yes.
Um, uh, one of the things that strikes me is I never had a community of adoptees. Um, and in the last few years, partly because of our mutual friend John Campitelli and others here in the States, all of a sudden I feel connected in that way. And so when we started to talk, I am amazed, but really gratified that this exists because I can imagine, and as we've talked, my situation is very different from many people who have been intercountry adoptees. Um, and so I'm so glad, first of all, and I'm going to share the URL in the description so people can access this. And there's a really wonderful video about rethinking adoption, and some of the key messages from that video that I think will really benefit people to look at. So thank you and for doing that, for creating that. I'm guessing that it was partly for your healing and your working
Absolutely.
through, but also partly because of your heart being so big and caring. So, if we talk about reimagining, and we're only going to touch the surface in this interview, in this conversation, and I realize that because I want people to watch, I want people to see this and get to know you and the organization if they don't. Um, what are the things that have struck you in your 27 years that, and I won't use the word wrong and right, that are problematic around adoptions, whether it be in a country or just adoption in general, in your opinion?
Mm. Mm. Well, fundamentally, adoption in its current form actually obliterates our ability to know who we are as our origins. That includes who our mother and father is, our brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, grandparents. It includes in intercountry adoption being removed from our country and culture and language and being completely severed from it and not having any easy way to actually be able to know any of that. That's all of our origins. And if you're a country that's signed up to the UNCRC, United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, it does state as Article 8 that we have a right to our origins. It's a fundamental agreed upon right that every person who's born should have a right to know who they are born to, what circumstances they were in, and where where their parentage is from. Now, the fact that adoption doesn't support that, it's only if you've had amazing parents where they've kept you in contact or they've seen the value of your origins, of which in my era, it definitely was not even understood or even known. It was like they treated us as if we were a blank slate. So that is the fundamental error and problem with the current system of adoption is it doesn't recognize our origins or the importance of it. And it certainly doesn't understand or recognize that there is a trauma that actually occurs for us, a deep wound psychologically. I've studied psychology that actually occurs when we are ripped away from the mother who carried us for 9 months, and especially if we're ripped away at birth. Taken away from her and we never hear, smell, or feel her again. That causes a psychological injury, which has been written about by an amazing psychologist, Nancy Verrier, called The Primal Wound. And other books contested and debated, but most adoptees at this day will agree there is a wound and there is what we call a trauma that sits buried, unaddressed often, and doesn't really get healed. Now, the
And
issue is that is grief,
well,
and we have an unresolved grief.
just to interject that's regardless of whether the adoption is good or bad.
Good or bad, that's right. Yeah,
That's really
yeah,
important that we've been finding. Sorry.
yeah. And I prefer to use the word displaced. We have been displaced. Like, I'm a
Hmm.
mother today. I have 2 children of my own. When I was pregnant and then when I birthed my children, I cannot imagine the sheer pain and trauma I would carry every day if I was forced to give my children up for whatever circumstances, and I'd never see them or even hear of them or even know what happened to them ever again. Now, this is fundamentally what adoption does to this day. It assumes the mother is a blank slate. She's going to have no feelings once she gives up the child. It assumes the adopted child is never going to have any questions about their origins, and that they're never going to care, and that they're going to go off and ride off blissfully in the sunset with this new family, and everything's going to be rosy and wonderful. And I know that that's actually not the scenarios that often play out. So these are some of the biggest problems with the current system of adoption. It is based on a lot of assumptions that are not founded in any science, and it's also been made from the point of view of only the adoptive parents, because they were the ones, let's be real, the Hague InterCountry Adoption Convention, the Adoption Acts that were all created in the 1940s, they were created for the needs of prospective parents. They were not created in combination with discussions with birth mothers and fathers and families and communities. And they certainly were not made in discussion with us, grown-up versions of us, who had any idea of these experiences, who could tell you that, oh my goodness, there's like a lifelong impact, that each stage of our life we are hit with another layer of impacts as adoptees. People are just not generally aware of what adoption actually is and how complex it is.
Yeah. Did so, I can imagine there will be folks well-intended watching or listening saying, well, isn't it better than? Isn't
Better than
adoption
dying?
better than?
Well, you could ask those kind of questions, but I guess unless it better than what? Better than what? I can say I've had an abusive adoptive family. Were they better than my birth family who were poor and in poverty in a war-torn country?
Right.
It's
Right.
kind of like, how do you judge oranges to pears?
Yeah.
You got complete, and so one of the myths that I actually target in that video series that I took, that you've briefly mentioned, that you've watched, that I've produced, called, Rethinking Adoption, is specifically about that. It's not better. It's just different. It's just as complicated as what we would have had if we had stayed in our birth countries. No doubt it would have been a complex life if we had stayed where we were born, but no doubt it is just as complex, and even more so, I would argue, to displace us, cut us off from everything that should have been ours, and not ever let us have access to know what that even is. So I really don't like the word and the assumption of being better off, because that's often gauging things only from a material point of view, when you're considering that our families might have been poorer, less educated, having less access to resources. So really, what's better about that, except for the fact that we should be pointing out that adoption is all about inequity. It is about families who have less whose children are born to that less lucky family and taken and given to families who have more, where they have more resources, more access, more support. And we assume that they're better. It's debatable because a lot of adoptees actually experience a lot of emotional challenges in these adoptive families, where even though the family has more resources materially, emotionally, and spiritually, they're bankrupt. So, what is better in this scenario? Is it better to have more resources and better to be emotionally bankrupt and to have mental health issues? Or is it better to have a soul that's not fragmented from the impacts of being displaced, but yet be poorer materially? And I would, I have my own thoughts on that, but every adoptee has their own views on that.
Yeah, and at least if we can get the conversation to focus away from that and onto, all right, what has happened as a result of these adoptions? The thing that I continue to struggle with because I continue to get doors shut are the fact that adoptees are the last person to have a say
That's
in
right.
their lives.
Yeah. And your very name of your documentary, My Place at the Table, this is the key thing I have fought for decades, is that the tables where decisions are made about us actually include our voices and stop making decisions about us without us. That's just ridiculous that our whole lives are so controlled by an external force and structure and system that's upheld by governments and parties, and yet they don't invite us to the tables and ensure that we actually can bring in our lived experience and talk about the complexities so that they can actually factor that in and change it. We need more voices of the biological families and communities to be heard in these adoption discussions. We need more voices of the adoptees who grow up displaced and experiencing it, confused, never knowing what their identity is and trying to find it, trying to find their place in the world. Like, where on earth do we belong when we've been so severely displaced? Those voices need to be in there. And yet, the whole industry of adoption is very much dictated and determined by the loud voices and the demand and the money that actually goes with adoptive parents and any parents, whether it be surrogacy, donor conception, or whatever. But when they are the ones with the money and the power, they can create their own laws and legislations that allow a process to give them what they want. And that is exactly what adoption has been, and it's exactly what surrogacy is as well. It's who can buy and pay for what they want, gets the loudest voice and the biggest place at the table, and they get to dictate the laws and the legislations without any concern for the people that they're stepping all over, you know?
And it seems to transcend the issue, whatever the
Yeah,
is, whether
it's
it's
what they want. It's what their
housing,
needs are. I
employment.
need to make a family. I need to be a parent, and I don't care how I do it. I'm
Yeah.
just going to have it. I
So
mean, God, yeah.
no, I get it. Which is a nice kind of transition to our last topic for today, for this conversation, is some of the things that you've talked about that don't work, that aren't appropriate, that are just disenfranchising for adoptees. If you were to design this ideal system, I guess the first question would adoption exist? And then if it does, in a very big principled way, not because I don't want you to have to go feel like you have to go into the weeds, but what would that look like? What would be the building blocks or the foundational tenets of that
Mm.
kind of system?
Mm. Yeah, I definitely don't support the current system of adoption because, we've had 70 years of it in intercountry adoption to know all the problems. And, you've had country after country do an investigation of these past practices and deem it highly, inappropriate, unethical, and abusive of our human rights. So we can't get away from that truth that we now have, which has, knocked on the door in the last 10, 15 years in particular. What we need to move to, I believe, and where we should go in the future, and I've actually suggested it to one of my colleagues last night, is we actually need to get to the stage where we're really starting to look seriously at what is a potential solution? Like, I believe we're always going to be in a position where we have vulnerable children, where there is a need to accommodate these children's lives and help them navigate so that they've got support, so that they've got some sense of belonging, identity, family sense around them, community. But we need to move away from the current form of adoption because it is known now and it's caused a lot of damage. We should be learning off what we've done wrong to design and create something better. So my suggestion is that we need to get the world's experts together. It needs to include the triad. It needs to have a heavy debate on what really would be a better option given all the complexities. Like crossing country borders is extremely challenging. How do you ensure that a child is protected in their citizenship rights on both sides? Like, for people like me, I argue, intercountry adoption should have allowed me automatic citizenship in my birth country. Why the hell I've had to fight for 52 years and I still can't even get it? It's ridiculous, right? We should be dual citizens of the countries that we're going between, and that should have been a basis for the beginning. So there's so many high level issues that need to be addressed in a new form of care. It needs to uphold the rights equally, if possible, between all three parties, the biological families, the adoptee, and the adoptive parents. Now,
And that
that's
one is
a
just
huge ask to be
right.
able to do.
That's the triad that you're referring to, because
Yes.
some folks may not be familiar with that. But yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if we're listening to each of those, we're hearing then truly not only their points of view, but the needs that they express, and the ones that we haven't really heard from are the adoptees for so
Yeah.
long.
Well, the biological families, I would argue, we have not heard from either. Not en masse.
Especially the mother,
Yes.
especially the mother, as
Yeah.
we, you know,
But the fathers too. Yeah, a lot
yeah,
of these fathers have don't even know they've got children who've been
right,
sent abroad and didn't even know they were a father.
yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of disenfranchised parents out there.
So our film, now that it's completed, in addition to looking at distribution and festivals and finding ways to reach out to folks, is really entering that phase of trying of and I see why there's a lot of complementarity between your organization and this film. But how can this film be used as a way to encourage, inspire, make people aware of situations with the hope that there could be some action around change, action around even just change of attitude.
Yeah, yeah.
How
Your
do you,
film's
as our last, yeah, and that's what I was going to ask, as our
Yeah,
last
you,
question.
your film is good because it really says, where's my place at the table? Now, your place at the table you looked at in your film was definitely just talking about within the family table, your little micro
Mhm.
environment. But I would argue that that's like a mirror for the bigger, larger table where we should also be able to find our place, to have our voices at the big tables where adoption and the future of looking after vulnerable children is to be discussed and decided. If we can be invited to those tables where we can actually discuss with all the power structures. I remember in your documentary, you went and chatted to the priests and you talk about the role of the Catholic Church. Like, yeah, we really need to have these discussions at these important tables. We need to be able to come and talk to the institutions who facilitated our adoptions. We need to we need to make sure that they hear our experiences and that they step up and actually take responsibility for each of their roles that they did. And also, if there truly is an understanding and that religious viewpoint of we are representatives of God on earth, then you would hope that they would have the right empathy and compassion to do the right thing by these people when they acknowledge that there has been serious questions around what they've done in the past and what they've contributed to. So that's the kind of discussions I would like to see at tables. And I think your film is a good beginning place for helping people to understand the importance of finding our place at these tables.
Thank you, Lynelle Long, the founder and director of InterCountry Adoptee Voices.com. I'll put that up on the screen so folks can follow up, and or ICAV for short. It's I really appreciate having this conversation with you, and I look to this as just the beginning of our conversation and of our opportunities for us to share and collaborate together. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Santo. Great to be here. See ya.
Thanks for watching, and look forward to more conversations about adoption, as well as our film, Il Mio Posto, a Tavola, My Place at the Table.